Welcome back. Happy New Year. And here we are in the second term. And for the first week, what we were really looking at is British indirect rule and the type of imperialism that involved and looking specifically at Nigeria. In some ways, this builds on earlier topics that we've looked at. It builds on the Baba of Cairo autobiography that we studied last term, and it builds on an understanding of the type of situation in which European countries came to establish their rule in sub-Saharan Africa. And in order to understand that, there's a very strange concept, and not a strange concept, but the way it was used, because this is period in African history after about 1900 is often referred to as the colonial Africa and colonialism. But the term colonial, as used in Africa, had an extremely different meaning than it did earlier and in other parts of the world, because the word colony usually means that people go over seas or into new territory and settle. In large parts of Africa, no Europeans went to settle. They did in South Africa. They did to some extent, in Angola for Portuguese. They did a few in terms of British in Kenya. But they did for French in Algeria. But overwhelmingly, Europeans did not move into the European territories that were called colonies. And so that colonial Africa was quite different from the colonies in North America or the colonies in Latin America, Brazil, and so on. And more accurately, we really should call this period of European occupation that lasts roughly from 1890, 1900 until countries become independent, mostly beginning in the 1950s, but especially in the 1960s and extending even later in the case of South Africa. We really should call this a period of European dictatorship in Africa, because European colonial powers were running governments that were not based on anything other than military occupation and dictatorial rule. And how they did that and why they did it is really what we want to look at in this first week, and I'm going to do that in the context of Nigeria. Now, Nigeria technically wasn't even a colony. It was referred to as a protectorate. And so the British had another legalism that distinguished between colony and protectorate. And so we're going to do this in two ways, in addition to a PowerPoint lecture that explains the whole context. One, we're going to look at a novel by an extremely important Nigerian novelist, Chinua Achebe, and his wonderful novel called Things Fall Apart. And this is a novel about the initial imposition of British colonial rule in southeastern Nigeria and the area that is inhabited by Igbo. And this is specifically a story about the contradictions that arose as a result of local people in Igbo land trying to adapt to British rule, and what that meant in terms of the clash of cultures and politics, and how it was interpreted locally. And hence his title, Things Fall Apart. And the second is we're going to look at a video by the novelist Joyce Carey entitled Mr. Johnson. And this is a wonderful video about British colonial rule in northern Nigeria. And northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria were initially two different protectorates within the British Empire, and amalgamated only in about 1918 into the Protectorate of Nigeria, but still retaining its regional divisions between northern Nigeria, which is in fact about 3/4 of the country of Nigeria, western Nigeria, and eastern Nigeria. Western and eastern Nigeria being roughly the Yoruba-speaking area, western Nigeria, and the Igbo-speaking region, eastern Nigeria, and really being southeastern and southwestern, not east and west. So in looking at this, the video, the movie Mr. Johnson by Joyce Carey takes place in northern Nigeria. So who was Joyce Carey? Well, he was a colonial officer. He was a colonial officer in northern Nigeria. So even though it's a novel, it's in part based on his own personal experiences in northern Nigeria. Mr. Johnson is his African assistant who, in the construction of a road project in northern Nigeria. And you'll see from the story, from the video, the contradictions and the conflicts that arose between, some of them cultural and misunderstandings. The British colonial officer, in a sense, modeled on Joyce Carey himself, and Mr. Johnson, his African assistant, have very different views of the world and very different views about how things are done. And that's the basis of the story, which is in some levels initially sort of humorous, but in the end is actually quite tragic. But to understand that Joyce Carey was an officer there raises a couple of interesting points. One, he was a moderately successful British novelist and writer. So you have to know that about him to appreciate who he was. And second, you have to understand that the nature of British colonial rule, as it was called in northern Nigeria, had one very distinct criteria. Every single British officer who worked in northern Nigeria had to know the local language Hausa, had to learn Hausa, and they learned Hausa at Cambridge University. And unless they passed the examination in Hausa, they could not be posted to northern Nigeria. So that even though this was a British colony, the British officials had to understand the local language, because there were never enough British officers to really impose the British dictatorial rule if the officers didn't actually understand the language. They couldn't have done it otherwise. So these are the two features of this of this week, besides my PowerPoint lecture. One, Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, and second, Joyce Carey's a book, Mr. Johnson, which is turned into a wonderful film.